It is said that truth is stranger than fiction, and as we look into our past and the deeper foundation of our legends and planetary heritage, I for one believe it. And in this strange beings presentation, we'll skim over some of the enigmas of our planet in human form, and trust you'll later be with us as we explore strange human abilities and strange creatures in our other reports. Now, separate reports can be had on some of these subjects, since time always limits these explorations. And to gain a foundation on where the present humanoids came from, it should be pointed out that in our present uniform 5-foot species, it's been very recent that we've had these bodies in this particular dimension. Now, there was a time about 14,000 years ago when the legends say the gods walked among us. It says there are many, many more varieties of Homo sapiens than at present. And it's not at all unusual today to see throwbacks to these unique types in various parts all over the world. Some of our ancestors were said to be developed from amphibious creatures that came out of the ocean. Humans are continually being born with short tails and very undeveloped gills, for example. Tiny gill holes are not uncommon in children, and usually aren't even noticed by other persons. Now, this is an example from an old medical text of a man with an extra auricle and gill on the side of his neck here. Here's an example of a woman in the same text. Now, once in a while, a child will drink milk, and some of it will escape through these tiny slits along the rear jawline on the neck. Persons with unique body structures often wind up in circuses if they have larger deformities. Other infirmities, like persons with joints that allow them to become the rubber men, tying themselves into knots, and people with scales and unique skin and excess hair and such. We'll cover these things later. Well, in the last appendix section of the final Lord of the Rings volume by J.R.R. Tolkien, he mentions that the present species of humanoid was the most desirable and adaptable. And the ancient kings and lords of the ancient times, so they converted to this size. And many other smaller and larger species were eventually destroyed. Now, some people that knew Tolkien said that he got some of his manuscripts, the ideas for his books, out of the British Museum. And a lot of actual prehistory is touched on in his works. And occasionally, persons with outstanding psychometry and psychic reading ability will shed more light on these very early periods that are none of the history books. Now, one species we do hear about are pygmies. Virtually all areas of the world have records or traditions of pygmies. And invariably, the larger species of man simply can't coexist with them, and they systematically exterminate them. Now, tradition tells us they once had civilizations equal to the rest of humanity, but had to start living simple life in remote areas just to stay alive. Now, here we see they're being persecuted by hunters. Once had tree houses to stay out of the reach of animals and other tribes. Now, in both African and Latin American jungles, many of the recent pygmies have built tree houses to keep clear of the predators and other humans. This is an early picture showing the tree houses. It did little good, of course, when guns came on the scene. There were dozens of fascinating pygmy tribes described in the old historical works. Some tribes were great hunters. Some were said to even be able to kill elephants by running under them and running their spears up under them into the heart. Now, some of the African dwarf villages looked like this before the great persecutions forced these tribes back into the remote caves and remote jungle areas. Du Chaillu was an explorer and writer who lived with several pygmy tribes and said they were all extremely intelligent and shy. Only one tribe did he ever run across that was dangerous and killed outsiders. And this group had a yellow complexion, he mentioned. Now here's an explorer of the 30s, an African pygmy tribe about 4 feet high. But pygmies aren't confined to Africa even today. Pygmies have been living next to civilization without making official contact for years all over the globe. And a typical example is the rough forest regions just west of Sydney, Australia. For years now, farmers and travelers have been chancing on a primitive pygmy who lived in the same area here with them. And both the larger Aborigines and the pygmies of Australia are a Negroid race, which were said by Akashic record readers to have come from the New Guinea area thousands of years ago, over a little land strait there. We might mention that Greek historians wrote of pygmy races dwelling in the heart of Africa a couple of thousand years before they were discovered by present explorers. Yet these same historians are sometimes scoffed at when mentioning Atlantis and other phenomena back then. Actually, close to a dozen pygmy tribes were discovered in Africa alone just in recent past, and many are now evidently extinct or more deeply entrenched in the jungles. Now, early works in Latin America mention pygmy tribes, Central and South America, of course. Now here's a painting by Velázquez, the great Spanish artist, and he was fond of painting dwarfs. And remember, during the time of Rome, it was the rage for the ruling class to have a witty dwarf to show off. Even during the Middle Ages, most courts had at least one dwarf. And because dwarfs were given the right to speak freely, this was often a great aid in learning the truth about local events to everybody concerned. Now, Peter the Great in Russia, for example, had dozens of dwarfs in his court. And this is another painting by Velázquez of a dwarf. There are two general types of dwarfs. While one type of dwarf is born small and develops slowly, there's a second type that seems to be stunted by some malady or imbalance. Now, Roman emperors starved hundreds of children by depriving them of nourishing food just to get a few dwarfs for their courts, because they were so scarce at the time. And here we see another one of Velázquez's paintings. Now, this is Doña Isabella and her monkey. And some of the early paintings used this title because that was what they were known as. The dwarfs were known as monkeys at one time, to some degree. And some dwarfs were less than a foot high, and some a yard high, and others were fat, and others were thin. And most dwarves had a normal intellect, but there were an unusually large ratio of idiots during the 16th century. And many of the painters, of course, used dogs by their dwarves when they painted them to show the size relative here. Now, Lucia Zarat was only 20 inches high. And here she is at age 15. She was known as the Mexican midget. She weighed 5 pounds. This is Lavinia Warren and General Tom Thumb, both of them being very famous circuses. Now, it was the famous P.T. Barnum that made Tom Thumb famous. And he was 25 inches tall. He was married for 20 years, became very wealthy, owned a sailing sloop, pedigreed horses, and a carriage. Well, circuses continue to find dwarfs and midgets, display them in the circuses, and this is a young lady of the 30s. Oddly enough, many freaks and Dwarfs and midgets didn't lack for persons interested in marrying them at all. Now, unlike the pygmies of the jungle, the little people in society, civilized countries, usually had a fairly good life after the time of P.T. Barnum. The circuses usually took care of them, and they made reasonably well good livings. This is a photo behind the scenes of one of the circuses. Now, while most pygmies shun society and the waves of society, there is one secluded tribe of actual dwarfs that are living in Yucatan below us that actually get Mexican machetes and use cloth, but almost no one ever sees them. Now, from accounts of the last few years, these little people are 3 to 4 feet tall and wear a strange ankle-length dress. And they use these Mexican machetes, and no one knows where they got them. Journalist Bill March did an article on them in an August 1984 Fate magazine. He mentioned that they're petroglyphs in the temples thousands of years ago had the little Mayan natives. And evidently this tribe, or these small people, are thousands of years old, because the legends say that they've always been in this area. And almost nothing is known about them, even yet. Well, thousands of years ago, we had tiny little men that were scarcely a half a dozen inches long. And how we know is that their actual artifacts have been found in bones. 65 miles southwest of Casper, Wyoming, there was a tiny 6.5-inch tall mummy. It was discovered in a gulch by a couple of prospectors. Well, anthropologists x-rayed this tiny form and determined that he was an actual tiny human form, about 65 years old when he died. And Ivan Goodman of Casper still has the mummy of this tiny little man at the last report. And this isn't a very good photograph, but it'll give you some idea of his size. Now, there seem to be many classes of humanoids that just defy description and classification. There's some sort of 4-foot monkey men that have been seen in remote mountain valleys in Alaska, for example, or up in the Northwest Territories. There have been a number of miners that have been scared out of their wits, scared out of leaving their areas because of the agitation from these little creatures. They're not of the usual pygmy or dwarf tribes and species. They're more animalistic species. Now, even today, some of these strange little creatures pop up in the news. In 1981, for example, there were a number of persons who saw a strange little green creature that somewhat resembled a giant lizard or baby dinosaur, had a big tail that walked on 2 legs, and was confronted in a sewer drain, according to reports in the Valley News Dispatch of Pennsylvania in 3581. Well, this gray monkey-like creature was what confronted a Canadian when he crawled into a tunnel looking for a lost kitten. He said it hissed at him and told him to leave, and then left. And a Sunday Sun newspaper article of 3/25/79 described this and other bizarre incidents. He said, "I'll never forget it. It hissed at him, 'Go away,' and then it took off. He was shaking with fear," he said. The newsstand tabloids pick up on many of the stranger species on our planet. And in the remote Rhodesian Zambi Valley, there's a tribe with 2 toes, very much like an ostrich's foot. And they live in trees and anteater holes and caves. And several studies have been made on these shy, backward Vanya people. Here are a couple of pictures from Grit. They have over 184 cases of a family in New York State who had the same type of foot. Well, this family were called the crab-toed people. And they were a very backward clan that all stemmed from a woman immigrant who came to the U.S. in the 1800s. And such cases are another throwback to the strange tribes of the ancient past. Another example of the same family. Many of the strange creatures of the past were said to be made up by the gods. In some of the ancient Sanskrit and sacred texts, it said that the early gods turned themselves into various creatures when they arrived here. And as pure energy forms with mind over matter ability, they could experiment with finding which forms they preferred best in nature. Well, eventually, of course, they found the Homo sapien form to be most adaptable. It was able to survive under almost any condition, more so than any other species. While their powers last, the gods were supposed to be delighted with making themselves into half men and half beast forms, becoming giants and specters, and scaring the primitive man cultures of his time. And while many of these forms weren't of physical substance, they were awesome and frightening to our forefathers. Later, some of the ancient documents tell of the gods' powers being taken away because of their abuse, and no longer could they go on in their pyramids and rejuvenate themselves and their forms. Later priests kept some of the legends alive, though, in a distorted form. You can read of such regeneration in many historical works on Egypt. And it's said that when the gods first came to our planet, most of them landed up in Atlantis, because this is where most of the culture was. And the rest of the world, they built pyramids and had the ability to rejuvenate themselves for a couple of thousand years. Came as a great surprise and shock to many when they found out that they no longer had their powers, and so they tried to preserve their vast knowledges in writing and in stone all over the planet for when their souls returned to other human bodies. And these and other prehistorical accounts, of course, you can find in some of the old Sanskrit records and certain old Hermetic records that found in such works as The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly Hall. And many of the ancients associated the gods with giants, and it might be good to remember that the giants also covered the world at the same time that the pygmies were here. And Magellan named an area in South America Patagonia because the giants that inhabited the region had huge patas, or sandals. Several other late Spaniards confirmed Magellan's giants. Turner, the naturalist, saw 12-foot natives along the Brazilian coast. Many other confirmations are available in the records of this era. And when our forefathers arrived in these Americas, of course, they found mounds all over, and the Indians of the East Coast told them the mound builders were originally giants, and took their forefathers hundreds of bloody years in battles to exterminate them. And many of their forefathers wound up as slaves working for these giants building these mounds. There's strange mounds and tombs and things all over the world, and in Europe particularly, many skeletons have been found in the various tombs that were from 15 to 25 feet long. Many of the details are found in Gould's Medical Curiosities. And even larger skeletal parts have been found, but few men of science will lend their names to any such evidence as that. A Cumberland English example had 6-inch teeth and carried a battle axe head that was a yard long, as an example. Well, many people call themselves Christians and scoff at such ideas that aren't in the science books, but they don't remember that in the 6th chapter of Genesis, it was recorded there were once giants on the earth. Most got destroyed during the flood. And once in a while we have throwbacks to such tribal lines, and such specimens once toured with carnivals. Most lived rather short, uncomfortable lives because of the added wear and tear from the extra gravity. Well, most of us are aware of the stories of Goliath, a 9.5-foot tall giant who wore a 200-pound armor suit and had a 25-pound spear. But in the same Bible is mentioned of another giant, the King Og of Bashan. He slept in a 9-cubit-long bed, which would have made him 12 foot in length. Now, other giants in the Bibles are mentioned in Numbers 13:22 and 13:33. We find Moses sent spies to Canaan, who found the Anakim race of giants living in a city called Hebron. Now, there have been dozens of skeletons from 9 to 17-foot humans that have been unearthed all over our planet. Few persons realize that there are hundreds of spear points over a foot long that are common all over the world and continually found. Virtually all the Indian tribes across the Americas have legends of their forefathers battling with the giants who once inhabited this Congress and this continent, and they were called Sitakak, and in the west eventually were driven into the Mount Shasta area and died out there. Now, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, and Incan literature tell the same story. We tend to ignore the Indian legends and pick up on the European legends, guys of fairy stories and such about the giants. And these have less truth in them than the Indian legends as a rule. As an example of one of the skeletons found, there was a discovery in Lovelock, Nevada, by professional archaeologists of UCLA. When they presented with the evidence of these 8- and 9-foot bones, they dismissed them, ignored them. And what you see before you here is an 1895 9-foot vault, found here with a woman and her child in it. It was from Yosemite Park, and the Awanichi Indians there had long maintained that there was a giant in the area, and this was proof. And scientists in Los Angeles authenticated this find, but today the remains are conveniently scrapped or forgotten. And this is from an actual photograph of that period. Another sarcophagus that was found in Salt Lake City area had the remains of a 12-foot specimen in it. It was in a March 14th issue of the 1891 Desert Weekly in Salt Lake. And on the East Coast, many discoveries were made, similar remains. Various mounds west of Chatfield, Minnesota, yielded 6 skeletons that were huge. This was according to the St. Paul Pioneer Press, number 5, volume 8. And then there were many legends of the Sinbad and such, as you can see here. Many persons have to have better evidence, and here are photographs. Jack Earl was a famous circus performer and giant, also a poet. The skeleton is the Irish giant, and the Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine by George Gold. It was put out in 1896. The Chinese giant Chang Yu Sin. Robert Wadlow was billed as the tallest man that ever lived by circuses a few years ago. The daughter of Chief Winnemucca for whom the Winnemucca, Nevada city is named after, exclaimed that the giants were exterminated in that area by her people early in the 19th century. She said a small band of barbarians used to waylay my people and kill and eat them. They'd dig holes in our trails at night, and our people would fall in these holes. She said her people tried to make peace with these red-headed barbarians and giants, but they continued their barbarous practice of cannibalism, and the Indians killed them all. It's a 1984 picture of Chris Greener. He's one of the tallest men in the world at this time. He's from England. Ivan Marks of Northern California was the first person in this area of the world to photograph the Bigfoot. And here are a couple of his photos. According to Marks, the North American Sasquatch has a head shaped somewhat like a gorilla's, with some features of prehistoric man added. The eyes are small and pupils are reddish to prevent snow blindness. And his faces are hairy, and the whole body is heavily padded. Hairy is protection against the cold. While Ivan Marks' first photograph here was of a very young Yeti, here's a full-grown Bigfoot, Sasquatch. These Sasquatch have been seen by hundreds of persons over the wild North American areas, and they range from 6 to 9 feet and weigh from 400 to 1,000 pounds. The Indians formerly spoke of the Sasquatch more freely, but today they seldom speak about them because they're ridiculed on the subject in most cases. And in 1884, a Canadian Pacific train crew captured a smaller Bigfoot, and this was confirmed in a Delius resident of that area in 1959. In 1924, a logger was kidnapped by a Bigfoot who tried to interest his daughter in the Ostman, the logger. There are dozens of other strange first-person accounts. These are easy to find in various records and reports. This is probably the most famous of all of the Bigfoot photos. There are dozens of Bigfoot tracks like this that are found in the Northern California areas, and these are 6 and 17 inches long, about 6 to 7 inches wide, huge. Every now and then there's a citizen that runs across something like this. And in this case, there was a little glowing dome that was parked not far away, and this hairy ape man was walking with a flashlight of some sort. The man didn't find out by staying around exactly what was going on. This was in 1975 at Telem Bend. The newspapers in Northern California occasionally run stories on Bigfoot. It's an article from the San Francisco Chronicle, 1965. Richard T. Lee was an East Coast resident a few years ago that went around taking plaster casts of unusual footprints, and these are some examples, only one of which is a Bigfoot. And from this evidence, it's obvious that there's many strange creatures running around in this country yet. And many of the conservative scientists, of course, say that the Yeti tracks are bare, and what people see in the Himalayas and such are the red bear. But these are the tracks in front of you, and there's quite a difference, and most people that see the tracks are aware of the difference. And the abominable snowman, of course, is very similar to the Yeti. They've existed with us for thousands of years from all the accounts that we get. The New Scientist magazine of 1959 told of a number of old anatomical and zoological books from Asia that were illustrated with what we call the abominable snowman species. And a number of persons have described the species from first-person sightings. They usually say they have reddish hair and long arms, and they reach almost to the knees, and are much different from the red bears that also reside in the Himalayas. Pursuit had a detailed article on the abominable snowman in 1976 and gave many references and documentaries, and persons today wonder why we haven't seen more first-hand evidence, but in the past there have been numerous person-to-person contacts, captures, and even bodies of these giant wild men. All over the globe, the native tribes that live closer to nature have run across this species, and for the most part they seem to be timid and harmless. Well, some of these smaller species of big feet and giants and such are not so timid or hairy. As we just mentioned before, the Indians carried on quite a battle with their ancestors here before the advent of the white man. And many of these strange little humanoids turn up now and then. There are smaller, furry man-like creatures that have been seen in several areas of the world, and in 1937 discovery, a couple of African hunters tell of seeing such men and getting confirmation from local tribes. Monkeys they were not. Very similar to human beings, except very hairy. A humanoid monster named Spring-Heeled Jack kept London in terror for 60 years in the 1800s, and he was described as a hideous-looking man with red eyes and claws like an animal, with the ability to spit blue flames and leap a dozen feet in the air. Dozens of persons swore to this strange description and remarked that after mauling or frightening them, he would just leap and vanish away. Well, since we're into the exotic here, we should turn to the area of vampires and werewolves. Since the Balkan area of Europe has always been full of vampires, it distressed the British clergy when returning crusaders began to give eyewitness accounts of vampires. And William of Newborough wrote in his history books of these dead rising from their tombs and being vitalized by some supernatural powers. The accounts of Count Dracula came from stories concerning a Romania ruler named Vlad Dracul, translated son of the devil. He was constantly repelling Saxon and Turk invaders. Vlad eventually became quite ruthless and unfeeling and brutal. And until the 70s, thousands of tourists poured into Romania to see the castle of the counts. Well, Countess Elizabeth Bathory was another cruel figure who had bloodthirsty habits, and when alarmed soldiers of Hungary stormed her castle, they found 13 girls chained in cells and dozens of bodies buried around the castle. She'd killed hundreds to drink and bathe in their blood. In the 1900s, there was a German named Hermann who sold cut-rate meat until it was discovered he was selling the flesh of boys that he'd killed and sucked the blood out of. University professors later examined his brain, but they found no deformity to cause such inhumanity. Well, in 1980, there was a particularly vile outbreak of vampirism. 26 young women in the Indonesian isle of Sumatra died in their blood being sucked right out of them, and 21 other women escaped death, and they told of a man with long, sharp fangs who attacked them. The police tracked the evidence down to a man named Peter Vlakuda. He claimed to be the distant descendant of Vlad Dracula. They found that the man had served 3 years in prison for earlier starting up a cult that drank animal blood and eventually got caught drinking the blood of a young girl. Well, Sumatran police told a news reporter that Vlakuta would be slaughtered on the spot like a savage beast if he was ever caught. And so far, they haven't caught him. Well, vampires seem to be related to persons who in life were particularly vile or died by suicide. A Vienna newspaper for June 10, 1909 goes into great length about a local castle burned by peasants who learned their vampire problems came from this source. And in the Americas, there have been dozens of persons who've admitted they can't help trying to suck other person's blood. Stephen Copland is a well-known vampire hunter who's tracked down a number of East Coast incidents. Now, many other incidents are reported by psychic researchers and psychologists who deal with distraught persons, and various groups. An interesting case from Mexico involved a European family that discovered their older maid was slowly draining their younger daughter's blood, and this was in 1958. Well, what causes vampirism? Well, there are different cases of vampirism show different motivations and causes, and there are certain poisons that induce a cataleptic state. It's such poisons that are used by witch doctors in turning people into zombies. We'll discuss this a little bit later here. The human blood contains a high concentration of kinetic or soft particle electron energy, and persons whose negative lifestyle and thoughts keep their bodies depleted of this energy are often attracted to other persons with a greater charge. Just being around young persons is often enough to psychically leech off and steal some of this energy. And drinking the blood brings on even better results. Now, science is aware of a disease that's called hematodipsia that causes persons to have an overpowering urge to suck blood. And persons with this disease would best gain some iron through some other source than blood, because John Haidt, the London hotel keeper, had this disease and killed 9 persons in the 40s to satiate his desires and drives. It's interesting that sensitivity to light comes from a lack of iron in the blood, and garlic is known to break down red blood cells and remove the iron in them, giving some scientific credence to these legends and why vampires are allergic to light. Well, such drives may sometimes come from a genetic lineage, and some 15,000 years ago there were tribes on the planet that lived on blood. They bled off some of their domestic animals every day instead of slaughtering them. And even today, the Nasai tribes of Africa follow this tradition. Bats, of course, are bloodsuckers and have been used in the illustrations of vampires for goodness knows how long. The foundation knowledge as to what vampires are all about, though, has probably been hidden for thousands of years. We may never know. Magical schools and magicians such as Crowley, who is well known, have occasionally given pieces of pictures, and yet none have had the total picture. Thousands of years ago, there were certain immortals who lost their ability to regenerate their bodies through their former mental means. And they supposedly experimented with substitute methods, and one method which gave a great deal of magnetic regenerative energy to them was the use of warm flesh human blood and sexual fluids and hormones. And some of this knowledge is carried over in secret orders, and occasionally persons go overboard in this direction and they lose all their self-control and restraint. Well, some of the avatars have told us that cells are like persons. They need rejuvenation, and being joined in an opposite energy flux aids this rejuvenation. So rejuvenation techniques using placentas and glandular extracts from sex organs work for the same reason. And some of this background is covered in other presentations that we give, like Earth Story. Well, we all recognize that animals hibernate on occasion when the food supplies or weather problems come on. A number of humans have had the ability to go into this suspended animation state. A 1903 English mechanic told of a Margaret Bianuval who remained in a trance for 20 years. It started with a fear of the police visiting her. And another article in 1922, Scientific Monthly, told of many cases of persons being assumed dead, and sometimes even buried, and later coming out of this cataleptic state, and astonishing the viewers, of course. Well, from the accounts of morticians and hospital attendants of our times, there's probably hundreds of such cases every year where people go into suspended animation and later wake up. And how many people have found themselves in such a condition and had their brains go addled on them is hard for anybody to guess about. And many of them probably roamed around. Upsetting a lot of the population in times past. And in some parts of South America and the Caribbean islands, there are voodoo rituals that date back hundreds of years. And voodoo is a mixture of West African religious beliefs and ceremonial magic of earlier Europe and maybe a little touch of Catholic. As the dancers and music put participants in a hypnotic state, they can perform unique dancing. They talk sometimes in spirit language. Well, once hypnotized, it often happens that astral spirits take over their bodies and they can't even remember what they did when they return to normal. Well, one practitioner of voodoo not too many years back was making zombies. The sorcerers would usually use a drug that stopped all the vital signs and put the victim in suspended animation. And once taken for dead, they were buried. And later, they were dug up again and given an antidote and kept drugged. Well, during the labor shortage years in the mid-1900s, the practice got out of hand and the authorities rounded up dozens of these greedy sorcerers and they hanged them. They had hundreds of zombies working in the sugar fields at that time. One of the safeguards used by these sorcerers was to cut out the tongues of these poor unfortunate resurrected slaves so they couldn't reveal who they were. Then they'd keep them under mild sedation so they'd remain slaves, often working for nothing on these sugar plantations. Well, several researchers have found that tetrodotoxin from the pufferfish is the Bokor formula. Today there are thousands of Houngans or voodoo priests holding the ignorant in awe or terror to gain their following all over the islands. It's reasonable to assume that the body can easily manufacture its own hormones and or drugs to serve the same purpose when the need arises. And we'll go into this somewhat later here. Well, all cultures have generally recognized witches or shamans as persons of special abilities. Now, the negative witches that we're accustomed to seeing represented have used symbols and spells and samples of a victim to dominate other people, to destroy them and get their way. Well, positive witches and most shamans have used this supernormal ability to aid their fellow humans and upgrade humanity, though. During the Dark Ages, persons with such ability were often branded as witches and given an agonizing death, though, regardless of what they did. Today, hundreds of thousands still follow devil worship and cult leaders who continue in the negative goals that we spoke of, and human sacrifices are still occasionally found. Well, extra-normal abilities that are used in any of these cases come from concentration. The rituals are not necessary to those who can mentally concentrate sharply and steadily enough. Because actions which intentionally violate the choice of other people It is usual to see persons who use their powers for such negative persons get a dose of their own medicine when they do so. And in the early 70s, the karmic action was speeded up, and it's now possible to see unethical persons get repaid for their unethical actions in a matter of weeks or months. And the proof is in the simple observation around you and of people and what they get back. Well, if you think about the long drawn-out rituals that most cults and shamans and other people involved with this work have to perform, you'll see that it's a degree of concentration. It forces them to concentrate, put their mind in certain channels for any length of time there. Well, ghosts have been appearing for as long as there have been records, and the difference between ghosts and spirits, not always recognized, however. And a ghost is actually composed of energy particles put into a particular place and shape by a previous human who was in a violent emotional state at the time. Well, true ghosts then stay in the same general area and reappear when the conditions duplicate the time of the emotional upheaval. What people call ghosts are poltergeists in various spirit forms and other identities. The famed Red Man was not really a ghost when he appeared to Napoleon and Henry IV and Louis VII and other notables of old just before their downfall. Couldn't have been a ghost because it got around too much, even though the term was used here. Well, ghosts and most spirits can be eradicated by water, which is given a countercharge of the mental energy. And the holy water of many churches is an example of this water. And you have to find holy water that is properly charged, and not all churches have priests that can properly charge the water. Now, true ghosts will not pay any attention to people in the area. They'll just wander around on the area that they've always wandered around in. Now, the other phenomena, which are included in spirits and the like, are caused by human beings sometimes that are projecting powerful energy mentally. And the wraiths and the like are manufactured on purpose, usually, by this intense concentration. It can be sent at any distance. Many mothers, for example, will know when their children are in trouble, and at some time in their life will send a mental portion of their body, a false body, to comfort their child and look after their child and protect or save their child in an emergency. It often happens that people aren't consciously aware of doing these things. They just pop up in an emergency and are done by some of the inner, higher level components, the subconscious. Now, shamans and priests who create distant replicas of themselves or animal forms are likewise simply sending thought projections or telepoids. And how the body does this is outlined elsewhere in things like the modern human comprehension courses. And various nature spirits are not in this category. And nature spirits such as these sylphs are of an outside realm, outside of our dimension. These other dimensional vibrational areas contain many other life forms, and many of these are under the category of fairies. Many types of fairies. And absolutely none of these outside dimensional creatures or fairies, nature spirits and the like, will ever interfere with the choice of man, unless it's to temporarily help him to overcome an obstacle or an accident. Most of the interference that is of a negative nature are from negative identities, and often humans that are interfering, because usually only humans and negative entities will interfere with choice. These fairies, gnomes, and sylphs and other dimensional life forms involved with nature were invariably recognized by ancient races. Most like humans was the green men of the woods, and yet most all of the fairies and lake maidens resembled the female human species. The elves, who reside in remote areas of beauty, are human-like and love to dance and play. The elves and the many other nature spirits are the Inua, but the Eskimos maintain whole dominion over all of nature. Most of the American Indian tribes shared the same respect for such life forms. All of the tribes of the world recognize them. Most of the people that were close to nature knew that the help given by the nature spirits helped the vegetation be fruitful and the lower life forms to keep healthy. And children were often the only ones that saw them, the humans, because they had an open mind, I suppose, and kept the negative thoughts away. Well, many persons with the ability to perceive these slightly higher vibratory rates occasionally see these nature spirits and hidden people, even though they're adults. I've had a number of friends over the years that could see the different nature spirits, and while the woodland nature spirits are a little thicker in the eastern United States and the jungles and such of the rest of the world, there are usually life forms of this type all over, even in the deserts. And the hobbits, so to speak, or the little desert dwellers, are kind of sparse out in the Mojave Desert here, but they do exist in small tribes, and many people in these areas see them. Many different types and shapes and sizes of nature spirits, and these are supposedly goblins from the Norway area, but they're misrepresented to a great degree for these children's storybooks and such. But they are representations by various artists. You'll find pieces of truth are often hidden away in the fiction and fairy tales of the world. And this scene, of course, is from the Midsummer Night's Dream. Oberon the King and Titania, the Queen of the Fairies. One of the rarest of all the species of fairies are the tree spirits. They're usually quite large, and they are involved with helping trees. They're usually around groves of trees. There are only one in maybe 100 psychics that will ever see one in their whole life. There were a handful of the old master painters that could actually see the fairy kingdom, and they rendered good likenesses of these nature spirits and such. While we're covering the subject of other realms, we might look into the phantom people that mysteriously appear and disappear regularly all over our globe. And there are thousands of persons that yearly vanish, and only a small percentage are ever found or show up again. And how many of these switch into other time frames is a good question. Many persons start trips in boats and planes and are never heard of again. An area noted for this, of course, is the Bermuda Triangle. As an example, there were 5 torpedo bombers left their Florida base in 1945 and radioed that everything seemed strange while they flew over the Bermuda Triangle. No more was ever heard from them again. In 1963, a couple of stratotanker jets disappeared under similar circumstances. There are dozens of ships that have disappeared in the same area over the years. Now, in the Bermuda Triangle, under the ocean's depths, there are many strange monuments, walls, and pyramids. And the pyramid you see here is the largest pyramid in the world. And it was located in the 80s. And it was very advanced, and it was about 50 miles south of Florida. A well-made pyramid that had been unknown up to this time. And many feel that in this area there are time-warping crystals which evidently switch objects in this dimension to other dimensions. And this is a tale that we cover elsewhere. Now, in the case of persons disappearing in other parts of the country, in other areas, it's sometimes possible for such persons to bilocate or be bilocated through mental means. The human being, for example, is simply a mass of atoms or circles of energy. When the binding energy holding us together is altered, the holes can grow larger or smaller and slip into the dimension that corresponds with a particular vibratory patterns or rate that's desired. Now, how this is done requires a knowledge of how the higher human components function. Now, while we're on the subject of going into other dimensions, we should mention spontaneous human combustion, whereby the person goes into the other dimension through death, burning up. The Scientific America and the English Mechanic magazines detail cases as far back as the mid-1800s. Now, one drunk, for example, started to eat a lighted candle, and before he could continue, started internally burning up around the head. And in a short time, he was just a pile of dust. And another drunk was seen to be covered with a silver-colored flame. So a witness grabbed him and somehow stopped the fire, simply through his touch, disturbing the vibrational rate some way. The man had no pain at all during the burning, but he later died in agony when the deeply burned flesh was exposed for a few days. Now, the Boston Journal of Chemistry noted that there were some 50 cases of spontaneous human combustion between 1725 and 1847. And this is a 1763 classic on the subject that was put out in book form. The majority of victims were hard drinkers and were around open flames when they started to be consumed in this early period. A later treatise in the 1870s also indicated that victims were older drinkers, most often women, and often left with unburned clothing in a heap near the ashes of their body. Water seemed to increase the combustion. Now, various scientific journals up to the present have confirmed the phenomena, but offered very little explanation. This is a picture of a young victim of spontaneous human combustion shortly before he died. And this is his mother a short time later. All they found was a few ashes on the floor. This is a British teenager, 19 years old, Paul Castile. And he was walking down the street in England and suddenly burst into flame. And instead of having no pain, he was in acute pain. And suddenly, for no reason at all, he stopped burning. While he was burning, he said his mind was racing and it was like being plunged in the heart of a furnace. He could almost hear his brains bubbling, he said. He was writhing and moaning and curling up in a ball. He thought he was dying. There's no smoke, no flames. Took him a great deal of time to recover from the burns, but he did recover. And these are pictures from a national tabloid magazine, 1985. October 1981 Science Digest, there was an article on human fireballs, and in the drawing below we have what is left of a Dr. Bentley. And though the heat was burned up most of Bentley's body, at about 3,000 degrees, it was estimated, the rubber tips on his walker didn't even melt. Now, Charles Fort was a strange phenomena gatherer of a few years back, and he mentioned several cases of spontaneous human combustion in his book, the Book of the Damned. There's a similar phenomena that's recorded throughout history, and that is where the weapons of soldiers turn into flame. What actually occurs during such events? Well, it's a short circuit between two major energies of the body components. One mind component, for example, does not run on the usual kinetic electricity of the brain. But this now is a subject covered at length in the modern human texts. Now, alcohol in these cases tends to hinder the normal clean switching between the three minds, and it aggravates the proper emotional functioning so that sometimes there can be a short circuit. The subject of mermaids has long been categorized in the field of fantasy and wishful thinking, I suppose, but let's take a deeper look. Mermaids, or sirens, were once thought to lure sailors into the sea so that they could drown them. Many, many beautiful paintings depicted as much. Mermaids are mentioned in many of the classical tales. The Arabian Nights, for instance, span a year, about 3,000 years of history. And in this particular story, Abdul the fisherman pulled in the mermaid, and he was aware that she was one of the jinn of Solomon, and so he fled. He was deathly afraid of her. Well, many sightings all over the world of mermaids, and many saw a mermaid off the Scottish shore in 1909, 1809. In earlier times, there were many mermaid species all over the globe, according to historians. The English saw them regularly off their coast, and dugong and manatee have no doubt been mistaken for mermaids, as the experts explain, but numerous close-quarter accounts have them resembling humans, much too closely to dismiss as some fish theories. There were many fakes to be true because of the demand. Fake mermaids were being made up all over the years in Europe by 19th century fishermen and European taxidermists. And these often found their way in traveling fairs and circuses of the time. Well, this is what a good imagination can do on behalf of a good artist. There are many fairy tales that have been woven around the mermaid legends, of course. The classical painters have long stirred the imagination in this direction. Beautiful examples such as this. Well, while the scientific persons thought up ways to disperse or nullify the numerous sightings of mermaids, there is much evidence to substantiate the reports. 1820 journal told of a mermaid which spent hours looking over an American ship. She was before the whole crew, and the upper portion was exactly like a human, and the lower portion was just like a fish. Well, in 1982, an edition of Critozoology, the magazine, shocked readers with an article by Ray Wagner, who actually saw a mermaid. He claimed to have talked to many intelligent persons all over New Guinea who swore that there were still mermaids in the area, and they were called Ree by the natives. And the New Guinea people assumed that the rest of the world also accepted the Ree, because even their cans of tuna sometimes carried their picture, they said. Your food, many of your things, your matchbooks, carry pictures of mermaids. What do you mean you don't know about them? Well, according to the reports, there are several mermaids have been captured there at various times. But normally the Ree try to stay clear of all the natives because some tribes still eat them. And Ree meat is still sold in some of the southern island areas. And every time the Ree get friendly with the natives, who are incidentally darker and sometimes even uglier than the Ree, they have problems. And while the Ree do not talk as humans, they whisper and whistle among each other. Wagner said the only facial feature different from humans was a little strangeness in the mouth area. And to persons in the area, the idea of Ree being an ugly dugong sea cow was a big joke. And later, zoologists returned to the area after the controversial article and confirmed Wagner's first story. Well, there probably isn't anything more unlikely than a mermaid, or maybe it would be a cyclops. The one-eyed cyclops are well known in legends, but few persons take them seriously. And actually, ancient tradition points to them as a possible reality, and several cycloptic skulls with a single eye socket and a double set of teeth have been found and dug up over the years. Well, according to tradition, the cycloptic species was created by a group of alien lords or gods of the ancient world. They needed a fierce overseer species to keep the animal man species in line, and they genetically created this lineage. Well, the origin of the Cyclops are said to be the legendary Isle of Shambhala, which was somewhere in what is now the Gobi Desert. And it was here that the Cyclops were created and bred and were sent to various colonies. Throwbacks occasionally occur, and a famous example was a Miss Clement of France, who was well known in the late 1700s for her single eye. Well, there are many legends about strange mermaids and strange people and strange events, and probably a good many of our fairy tales have some basis in fact. A good example is Cinderella. It's said to be a true story that's distorted somewhat. The original Cinderella was named Rhodopis. She was in Egypt, and while bathing one day, a large bird swooped down and picked up one of her fur slippers. Well, when the bird dropped it in the lap of an Egyptian king, he was fascinated, and he set out to find the owner of the cute little slipper. And after many difficulties, he did find her, and he married her and built the third pyramid of Gaza in her honor. And translators later mistook the fur for glass, since the words were very similar. And while we're on romantic stories, we should get into soulmates and mention them. And as an example of what a good relationship with a soulmate can do for peace and longevity, there's a case of one couple that lived in an idealistic harmony together for 147 years, and they were Janos and Sarah Rovin. They were Hungarians who were so attached they both died the same day. This is detailed in the Ripley collection. While the concepts of a soulmate usually involve one other mate somewhere on the earth, the odds are actually much, much better than that. The average person has several dozen soulmates available at any one time, because each person has a number of mind components that split up into male and female polarities when they come into this physical realm. Each component then has several opposites in the opposite sex somewhere on this planet. How these soulmates are formed and found is a much longer story, but suffice to say the Creator didn't shortchange us in any way if we'll but awaken to our potential. Well, continuing into the field of mental concentration should take up phenomenal super strength, because this usually does not come from muscles alone. There's a special energy, sometimes called chi or prana, that can be used by some persons to overcome gravity and change gravity, change strength. And persons who have a great deal of brain energy or electrical wattage can often perform miracles of strength. This is brought on by practice sometimes, and sometimes by accident. An Italian named Colli weighed 160 pounds as an example of the latter, and he was born with 2 hearts and had a great deal of chi energy. had a great deal of circulation, which upped his potential wattage. He could rip telephone books in two and toss 100-pound objects around like they were toys. And many of the Oriental martial arts practitioners can do amazing things by the chi energy that they use, not by the body strength or size. The famous Sandow here was well built, but he could do amazing things with his body. Had control over his muscles to a high degree, great deal of chi energy. Paul Anderson of Georgia is a recent muscular strong man of the 20s who could lift 400 pounds. He lifted over 6,000 pounds with his back, and later he became the Olympic champion. Earlier strong men included Louis Cyr, who could lift 4,000 pounds upright in the late 80s. Now, iron-jawed men like this have many times the normal jaw strength of 50 or 60 pounds. Shown here, he'd probably have 500 or 600 or 700 pounds of jaw strength. A Frenchman once exerted 534 pounds of force. Milo of Cortona was an Olympic champion 500 years before Christ. He could carry bulls weighing around a ton across the arena of that time. Well, gaining the awesome chi energy doesn't require so much physical effort and a body to match. It requires mental control, controlling the minds. The three minds have to be balanced. And one of the ways that some persons could store up chi energy was to get in a group. And many healers could not heal unless they had a group or a following to build up this chi energy that they could draw on and use. Well, walking on fire was another feat that required a lot of ki energy or chi energy. It was originally performed by various primitive cultures and eventually made its way to more modern cultures to accompany the cult and religious practices. The cult of St. John the Baptist in Buenos Aires has many followers. Walk over glowing coals is a test of faith, and dozens of members regularly cross the 1800-degree coals without a burn or a blister. Ripley once thought that the Fiji firewalkers that were so famous did not contend with that much heat due to the porous rock. She did disperse the heat as well as ordinary rocks. But researchers, when they went over, found that these rocks were hitting almost 800 degrees. Present-day Fiji firewalkers had to be absolutely authentic throughout this testing. And the firewalkers practiced today in Fiji and Sri Lanka and the Balkans and even some parts of the United States. And advertisements for training of firewalkers are sometimes seen in the West Coast, New Age journals and periodicals. In August 1982, Science Digest told of numerous Christian fundamentalist firewalkers in 6 southern states. Many fire handlers would use kerosene torches to prove their faith and immunity, and even with a self-induced trance, however, most couldn't contact the fire over about 15 seconds in most cases. There is a limit. Well, overcoming the pain of fire or self-mutilation is about the same. It requires a great deal of mental control. And thousands of persons have been able to overcome pain through mental means or have felt no pain for one reason or another at some time. And some persons have pointed out that animals and humans have different pain thresholds. And what is pain for one may not be pain true for another. A friend of mine had no internal pains. When internal problems developed after her internal sensing was reasonably normal, externally, she had a problem time internally though. She could feel what was contacted on the outside, but not on the inside. She almost died when this lack of pain allowed an internal infection to persist and spread. Well, many persons have been able to cut off the mind component responsible for sending the pain messages. And some of the Eastern mystics and cult followers who invite self-torture are a typical example. Some persons have even been able to operate on themselves, and the Countess Rosa Branicka of Poland once removed a cancer from her own breast in 1843, and she lived some 20 years longer. Now, animals are able to block off pain. One can see a mutilated or deathly ill dog wag their tail when they're given the slightest affection to redirect their thinking. You can see this for yourself. Well, Indian fakirs have frequently cut off the pain signals when they've laid on their bed of nails or wounded themselves, and Zani Azar lay on a bed of nails for 25 hours in 1969 to gain a record. By using hot irons and pins and hooks, the Brahmins of India can mentally stop the pain and heal the wounds at the same time. Well, tortured Christians and army malingerers and shot-up soldiers and yogis lacerating themselves, they all have occasionally been able to shut off the pain involved. It's all a mind development and control method. The eyes have long shed light on the origin of man or beast, and the legends about the eye being this determining the soul is very true. Determines the person. Dozens of persons have been discovered with very unusual eyes, and very unusual people, of course. Some eyes are phosphorescent and shine in the dark. Some people can see in the dark. Some glow red, and others of a different hue, and in some cases where these persons can see in the dark and have a different orange hue, there's throwbacks to early species that were better adapted to seeing in the dark and such. And in other cases, these persons carry a strong soul or entity fragments from a source distant from this planet. And there are many, many persons with green eyes on this planet, for example, that have origins or one component out of several that may be from an alien source at one time or another. And they come here and frequently carry over their green eyes, and this is a longer tale. But some life forms, for example, see in the silicon range, which is beyond the range of normal human eyes. And our eyes are adjusted at birth to seeing objects with carbon atoms in them, or a carbon base. And so everything on this planet is of a carbon base, and we cannot see silicon ranges ordinarily, even though we have planets in this system that can be measured by the scientists that are in the silicon range. Many worlds, many dimensions. Some persons have eyes that are adjusted to a little wider frequency range, and they can see many of the specters and spirits that normally persons can't see. And some persons see energy forms constantly raining down on the earth, and others have eyes and awareness that allows them to see all the vampire spirits and other life forms that so they can defend themselves. And some persons can see at night, and some see in the day, and they're night blind. There was quite a well-known case of Caspar Hauser, who was abducted in infancy and kept in a dark cell for 18 years. And when he finally got out and got loose, he could see the stars during the daytime. His eyes were extremely sensitive from then on. It's a little-known fact that young persons, children before 8, can have bodies that adapt very well, and after this age it's much more difficult. And the young man put in the cell with night vision, good eyes in the dark, was at a very young age. And in extreme cases, the children can change their bodies completely before 8. And from skinny little orphans, they can turn into giants and strong men and physically fit. And when the human soul first comes into the Homo sapien body, it adjusts to its surroundings for optimum survival when the person's very, very young and just born. And when it finds itself in a body that's subject to the influence of other species or animals, it adjusts the body to this new environment. And only the hereditary genes carry over the human abilities. Now, examples include the children raised by wolves. The American Journal of Psychology in 1927 told of a boy and girl who were found living with wolves and who never could be converted to civilized customs again. An early zoologist magazine mentioned 5 cases of wolf children, noted by an English colonel. And a 1924 Chambers Journal told of many more cases. Now, current newsstand tabloids still occasionally headline a wolf boy find. Only a handful of incidents, though, have ever been authenticated about monkeys and other primates bringing up human children. And again, it's the soul, when it first comes in, that adjusts the body to its surroundings. Well, we touched on soulmates previously, but there's another phenomena that's very similar. The people we recognize unconsciously in our lives are usually frequent, but our ever-present rationality promptly erases further thoughts about this closeness, and we go on believing that our acquaintances and loved ones are close just because of present chance and circumstance. Well, in truth, many of the persons in our lives have components of some mental and material energies that have been linked up with our components in previous lives and bodies. Many notable persons brought such previous relations to the attention of others down through the ages. And Rossetti, the great painter, was an example. We're looking at some of Rossetti's models here. He once met a model that he immediately felt very close to and quickly married. She died soon after, and he wandered around in deep grief until he chanced upon a painting done 400 years before that was almost identical to his former wife's. While searching further, he found a picture of the former painter and was amazed to see a form almost identical to his. Going over letters, he found that he'd mentioned to her that they'd been together previously under almost identical circumstances, and he knew they would be together again. And this, then, is a painting of Rossetti's great love, Elizabeth. And in other reports, we can cover this subject more thoroughly. Well, this is former photo of Wiley Brooks, and he's a breatharian. And the truth is that much of the energy of the body comes from the air and water intake and not the food. Breatharians need no food at all. I repeatedly point out to persons who take offense at this concept the fact that a pound of fuel will never keep a stove at 98 degrees more than a few minutes, let alone the many hours would it keep us humans as food. And the big problem in getting our energy strictly on air and water is that there's a limit to how much we can convert. Simply can't drink enough water. It takes years to learn to breathe in large amounts of air unless there's a certain amount of exertion. Now, unfortunately for most, the exertion frequently burns up about as much energy as the body's taking in. And no doubt about it, though, deep breathing from the solar plexus can bring about a great deal of extra energy and superior abilities to we humans. Now, there are some writers that advocate slowly changing over to a diet of fruits for a few years and then eventually switching over to pure air or become a breatharianism. But for the average person brought up on meat and cokes, this could be very dangerous. Very few persons could taper off slowly enough. Very few persons have ever had enough brain wattage potential. a little meat or animal substitutes like milk or eggs are essential to the average person's diet. They contain complex amino acids which keep the brain synapse points working at an optimum level so that you can survive in this low energy negative society. Without these additions, more persons become difficult to compete in the priority-based systems here. It's common to hear a pure vegetarian lament about the heavy negative vibes of civilization. They can't be around congested areas or persons. They don't have enough energy to set up a defense shield to protect themselves against most of these common vibrations. They can't think and compete as well. Now, Wiley was an exception, and he could pump the heaviest iron. He had a great talent for bringing in a lot of air through his lungs and having energy. But very few persons can perform like Wiley Brooks under the same conditions. Now, doing heavy physical exercise in society today is one thing, and sitting around like a yogi in India is another. You might take a look at India. For thousands of years, they've remained at a stagnation level under their dietary limitations. Thousands of years ago, the rulers noted that they didn't have enough land to graze cattle, so they made it a religious law. You couldn't eat animals. And they sat back in their castles and opulent living style and ate the meat themselves. But anyway, to find out if you have the brain wattage required to get into breatharianism, you'll be required to listen to your body. And if you get truly hungry, for example, you'll know that your body requires food. It takes a while to break in, a couple of years. This sounds like maybe silly perhaps, but very few persons today listen to their body and their brain feedback. They listen to the minds which constantly bring in memory pattern. One mind in particular constantly feeds in sensation, craving patterns to the brain. It loves the sensations of chocolate and ice cream and all the yummy junk foods. And it'll hit the memory patterns for such foods at the slightest frustration or opportunity. And anytime you get such patterns, you can quickly determine the source. Ask yourself or your body whether you're truly hungry or not. You'll get a true stomach hunger or you won't. And when you start listening to your body, you can get to the point that you know what kind of food you truly need. Well, this is a photo of Fräulein Neumann, who was a German woman that was a breatharian for 30 years. She never had any food or drink. And she was a stigmatist. In other words, she bore the marks and wounds of the Passion of Christ on her hands. And during her life, she saw throngs of curious persons flock to her on the Good Fridays out of the year when she bore these marks. Many persons were around her for days and weeks. Proved that she took no food. Alfred B. Glazier, the author of the Modern Human courses that we'll keep speaking about, was a person that visited her and spent time with her in Germany when he was there during the war. Now, Fräulein Neumann could not do hard physical labor on her diet of nothing, of air. And she aged. There are other breatharians that kept their youthful period and their looks. And in 1936, there was a woman called Bali Devi in India. And she was 68 at the time of her interview and press release. And she had not eaten for 56 years. And she reportedly looked like a child. Well, in the same general area of thought, people have long searched for the fountain of youth, and potions and lotions to make them young again. And the nearest thing to such elixirs have come through alchemical formulations, according to reports. Yet there was a case that occurred in South Africa that still encourages persons to seek a more natural formula. It seems a chief of the Swazi nation named Umbandine was given a simple formula that had been handed down by his father before him. Well, this smooth white paste and herbs was given to the chief's wives every 10 years to keep them young. And when a couple of the whites stumbled upon and questioned the chief's actions, he simply proved it to them by rejuvenating a 40-year-old white woman acquaintance named Miriam Venter. Seeing 18 years suddenly disappear off her age, the men were about to round up the ingredients from the chief when he was killed before they could get the entire formulation. And oddly enough, remember, this formula only worked on females. Now, certain natives in South America's interior are said to have rejuvenation formulas, but so many of them have been killed off in recent years, the possibilities of ever gaining the secret are very slim. Now, we've been covering some very strange territory here. And of all the legends of strange humanoid creatures on this planet, probably the strangest are those of the carrot people or the plant and tree people. Now listen up. Supposedly, some 9,000 years ago, there were still a few isolated groups of these creatures who greatly resembled humans, but internally took after the plant kingdom. And instead of being born in the womb, they had rudimentary roots going from the lower extremities, and instead of hair, a fine plant-like growth. Believe it or not, J.R.R. Tolkien, the great author, mentions a larger race of these people in his Lord of the Ring books. And in his trilogy called these people the Ent people. And he was said to have gained his data and sources and references for his book, The Lord of the Rings, in the British Museum manuscripts, very, very ancient manuscripts like the Red Book of Clonenrod. And most of the species were very small, though. And it was said that a few existed. And there are still some of the small species in the New Guinea jungle. Now, according to the rumors and legends, the native tribes have long had a dislike for them. They've dug them up and killed the young. And they've seen and run across these little top notches. They're growing out of the ground like carrot tops. Believe it or not, I do not know. All I know is that the legends are there and the stories are there. And where there's a legend and story, there's often a bit of the truth. In the last of Tolkien's Lord of the Ring trilogy, you'll find a section that's called Section A that tells about the Ent history. Well, we've already covered the Bigfoot and the abominable snowman, but few persons have ever heard of another strange caveman species that lives only in the Northlands. And cavemen and primitive races have always existed, living right alongside the advanced civilization. Here's a depiction of a 310-pound specimen that the Russians actually found in remote Tibetan mountains in the early 80s. And they're still studying him. A true caveman living right among us. And in the Yakutat region of North Siberia, the natives have often seen the Chuchuna, and some have been killed for thievery. Well, these Stone Age men are also found in southeast Siberia, and they're called Mulen, and given the new settlers there a hard time. Back when the Russian Civil War existed, and the settlers were coming into that area, regular wars going on. And in a book entitled Still Living by Myra Shackley, this archaeologist gathered evidence that Neanderthal-like humanoids are still surviving in the most secluded parts of the North. Well, how many different species of Homo sapien were around 20,000 years ago or so is anybody's guess. And there are skeletal remains from a few inches to almost 20 feet high. And quite a few of these unique specimens are still running around this planet. And in the past, there were occasional stories about how these wild men would come out of the hills and just wreak havoc with civilized people and their games. And true or not, we'll never know. Now, because dealing with bizarre subjects like this sometimes tends to bring in other dimensional spirits and sometimes even negative spirits, we should cover here a little bit of defense. It's seldom recognized that a human can send out the energies through the eyes and so-called chakras, and sometimes even you're attacked by negative people. So let's discuss how you can overcome this and defend yourself. Because of the potential danger of this chi energy that's sent out by the eyes, it's well to understand how to protect you. And for a person who builds resentment and starts concentrating thoughts of hate towards you, with any real concentration, these things can hurt you. They can drain you, drain your energy, and influence you. And you deal with it by putting up walls and blocks, because the Creator did not put you in peril and surround you without means of protection. Now, any of these outside dangers or attacks, like a mental attack, are easily detectable. If your body starts feeling drained or ill, it can be a warning to ask if you're under attack. Simply ask yourself, is this problem from an outside source? And if so, who is responsible? Well, your higher level component will act on this request, and you can often get a mental picture or a feeling about the problem. You may feel that a certain substance or situation is responsible, or you may get a recurring view of a person's face, noting that the person is sending these vibrations to you, these energies. And once you recognize the source, you can get away from the pollution or reflect back the negative thoughts of the sender. Simply visualize a mirror or a reflective envelope around yourself, sending back this negative thoughts. Just the thought of this is sufficient. If you must use a ritual, or in the name of Jesus, or whatever, fine. But it's a thought, strong thought that does the job. Now, water and quartz crystals have the ability to store this human thought energy. And for this reason, many shamans and knowledgeable spiritual teachers use these in the protective actions. Well, Catholic priests, for example, are taught to send strong, positive, and protective thoughts to water used in exorcism and such. And this ability was supposedly handed down from the advice of Jesus Christ and is contained in ancient manuscripts in the Vatican collection. And negative spirits and persons are repelled by this positive water. You go down to the Catholic Church and you can get some, and you can sprinkle some in an area where negative spirits are, and they will leave if it's charged up correctly. Sprinkle some on your front door, and you may be very surprised at the people that just won't enter your home, as strange as that may sound. And if you doubt this, try it out, and you'll prove it to yourself. Now, anytime you're around sickness and negative thoughts and energies, you can neutralize the contamination simply by washing your hands in running sink or tap water and such. This will run off the negative vibrations. If you run across somebody that's taken over by another dimensional spirit, you can ask them to leave. Note whether they are of reflection or domination and challenge them, and find out if they are of free or of the domination. And if you find out they're of domination and they must answer you, you can ask them to leave, order them to leave, in the name of Jesus Christ or whomever, because they know on the other dimension which side they are on. And if you, on this side, are keeping yourself in the free choice system by running the golden rule in your life, not being a negative person, then you have the right to send these people and the spirits in them and order the spirits out of them and aid them if you get their permission for this aid. Again, everything boils down to choice. All of these subjects we go into more deeply in other presentations. What you can remember is that you are free to defend yourself under any circumstances. There is nothing that can hold you back. No other dimensional creature or power or force that can stop your choice as long as you're following free law and granting choice to others. Now, if you're playing in the domination game and like to dominate people, then often you can get sucked in and you have no defense. Depends on which road you're running on. While we're into the concepts of distorted actions and the results, I should cover the fact that mankind broke loose the self-contained instinct knowledge 10,000 years ago. It was an egg knowledge. Everything was in the egg. It was a self-contained perfect knowledge. And within this instinct knowledge, man was in paradise. He was in Eden. But then there was a problem that arose, and there had to be a few little known safety features implemented by our Creator to keep things from going completely haywire. As an example, when we humans act unnaturally and begin to perform acts that deviate from the species normality in things like sex, and we have problems. And AIDS is a current example of a disease that attacks persons who practice unnatural sex and cannot draw enough vibrations in what we'd call the affection vibrations to fight the virus involved. Now, goodness knows how many hundreds and thousands of people AIDS killed in former times, or other similar diseases, viruses that were set up to protect the natural laws. Another example of these unknown and unrecognized laws is example of Kuru, which is a very fatal disease that attacks persons who are cannibals and eat human brains. And this disease is especially prevalent in New Guinea, in the backcountry there, and it's still well known by many researchers, even today. Well, human sacrifice is a major distortion of the Creator's choice laws, and it never fails to bring a society to destruction once the custom is entrenched in that society. And any detailed history book will prove the point to you. All systems short of the golden rule or choice are prone to self-destruct according to these inner laws. And you can go back into the history books as far as you care to go, and you can always prove the point to yourself if you do a little research. You cannot violate free choice law and keep a civilization or keep yourself contented and happy. This strange-looking object is an actual virus. It's a herpes virus, and it lives on healthy cells. Like most germs and viruses, it's more or less of a scavenger, and it has to live on other healthy cells. And the best eradication, or method of eradication, is to use a wavelength. And the wavelength is from the Creator, and it's called by some love and others affection. It eliminates these viruses. Many tests have been made. Healers, persons with affection, can use their fingers and place them on organisms such as this, and it kills them. And this, dear ones, is how healers work. They use the energy of the Creator. Well, now let's go on and explore further in our weird and wonderful humanity on this planet. We've just barely touched the surface so far. Many surprises yet to come. Did you know, for example, that some of our distant tribal relatives had slightly reptilian traits? And some even shed their skins yearly? Well, a throwback to this particular species showed up in 1850 when Mr. Bushirk of Missouri began shedding his skin every year. The Scientific American in the 1900s described his shedding process was very much like the action of a snake's shedding its skin. And did you hear about the Porcupine Man? In the 1800s, there were several members of the well-publicized Lambert family who had greenish quills, very much like a porcupine. And this phenomena had showed up for 6 generations in this family. It was probably a carryover from some distant tribal line that used such quills for added protection in their particular environment at that time. Well, of the case of the East Tennessee woman, who's twice shed the various bones in her body, is truly unique. The bones split into small pieces and then came to the surface where they were expelled. And these bones are immediately replaced by new bones inside the flesh. And the exit points are quickly healed over with only tiny scars. And this was noted in the Scientific American in 1891. We've mentioned persons with luminous eyes, and there are persons, though, with luminous body parts that have popped up from time to time and have been written up into the scientific journals. In 1935, Scientific American described Anna Monaro, who would occasionally have an area around her heart light up for a short time. And in an earlier Scientific American issue, they had a case of a woman whose toe remained luminous for 3/4 of an hour, no matter what she did to quench it or stop it. Might add here that the eyes are extremely powerful and send out photon energy, soft particle electron energy, that's able to take non-material atoms at a distance and rearrange them into material atoms. This is what Jesus was doing when he was turning the water into wine. And we do have information on this in other segments. Well, these girls are pinheads, and they work at the circus. And pinheads have smaller than normal brain capacities, and they normally aren't too intelligent. There are exceptions, of course. They usually do all right at the circus, make livings at least. And here are 3 pinheads and 2 dwarfs, early entertainers from the circus in the 30s. Bright, upstanding group, probably happier than most. There are numerous cases on records where both men and women nursed babies not their own when the need rose. Once the cells of the body communicate the need, they can quickly change to mammary tissue and produce milk. Girls and very old women have all nursed as much as was necessary. One Japanese woman was recorded as giving 12 pints of milk a day. Hormones in the meat of modern countries have been responsible for a much earlier maturity in girls for the past 20-30 years. Hormones are fed to chickens and cattle to accelerate their growth now. Men and male animals are on record as giving milk. Some early missionaries reported there was a tribe in Brazil who had the men of the tribe furnish all of the children's milk needs. Another example from the Gould's medical text. Contortionists have long been associated with the circus, been able to do amazing things with their bodies, dislocate their muscles. Contortionists like Sandow, who we pointed out before, could also use extra normal muscle control to perform amazing acts. Well, Chang and Eng were first seen by a captain at Bangkok in 1824, and they were rowing a boat. After a brief European tour, they came to the United States and eventually did well enough to marry. Unfortunately, the wives couldn't get along well at all, fought like wildcats most of the time. So they couldn't all live under the same roof, and they took turns living in each other's homes, and close to the end of their lives, Chang started to drink pretty heavily, and for the first time there was a little friction even between these two, these Siamese twins, and fortunately they didn't try to separate them from each other earlier, because later they found such an operation would have been impossible. It was a metabolism disorder that kept Benny here and his diseased brother Billy in the Guinness Book of Records. And this is Benny's brother Billy, a couple of years before he passed away. Well, Bill and his brother ran about 800 pounds, and fat people like them gain weight regardless of their diet, and some persons have had success by having a good portion of their guts removed so that the food they eat will not be as efficiently absorbed. Most circus fat women have ranged from 400 to 700 pounds, but cases of 1,000 pounds are in the old medical volumes. This girl was called La Monstrea. She was done by the great painter Carino, because she was not only dwarfed, but feeble-minded and grotesquely fat. All of this tended to fascinate people of a few centuries ago. In fact, people were fascinated up to a few years ago by fat people. Fortunately or unfortunately, the trend is changing, and people are no longer interested as a whole. And quite a number of fat people have reached their huge size simply because they ate too much. They had an unnatural craving for sensation. Because actually, fat cells remain at the same count in the body. They just increase in size. And thus it's possible to reduce, expand size by proper mental control. Either one. All you have to do is convince your body that that cell grows bigger or smaller. But this is a longer tail. Well, this 496-pound New Yorker just couldn't discipline his appetite, and this is the result. The gentlemen are standing in his pants here. Should cover the subject in a way, and some persons chase after various sensations in life and spend their lives seeking pleasure through perverted appetites, and few of these persons live long, since the body can only hold up under so much abuse, and gluttons are typical. Milo of Greece, who we mentioned before, was known to have eaten a whole 150-pound heifer in a day. And as Ediso Needles of Detroit regularly ate 15 chickens, 60 pork chops at a single meal. Like drug addicts and alcoholics, most persons who have no self-control at all are in deep trouble. Both here and in the physical, and in the non-physical astral planes after they die. Now, the lower astral levels are filled with unhappy souls who are getting their consuming passions erased from their systems the hard way. Now, because an alcoholic's mental projections are distorted, the alcoholic's astral body will be distorted. They'll often be around other unfortunates that exist in a joyless, distorted limbo of lost souls until they've become satiated enough to strive for clarity and for some self-control. There's a strange old book called Etidiphorphia that touches on the subject, and many psychics and astral travelers have seen these disgusting negative and lower astral levels that are reserved for persons with no self-control. Etidiphorphia, a very old book, very unusual illustrations. Here's another work by Hieronymus Bosch. Now, there's several fat men in recent history that have been known to weigh about 7,500 pounds, and these Japanese wrestlers are often almost this huge. These wrestlers are selected from large parents at birth, and when they're young, they're fed huge amounts of food until they are adults. Well, thousands of years ago, the Van Allen radiation belt did not block as much radiation as it does at present. The world's climates and food chains were different than today. And giants cannot efficiently live under today's conditions, so they died out. If you look carefully at this girl, on the lower left, you'll see that she has a tail. Velvet Magazine of Hollywood discovered this girl who felt that her tail was a definite asset and did not want it removed. And although we seldom hear of it, dozens and perhaps hundreds of persons have been born with tails. And every year, they're born with tails that are snipped off at birth. This is what a typical infant's tail looks like before it's chopped off now by the doctors in the hospitals. You can ask nurses about this. Now, many tribes of the past had tails, and examples include the Niams of Central Africa, and a tribe in Paraguay, who all had tails which went up to 10 inches in length. And in Gould's Medical Curiosities, there are many examples of both primitive races and modern Europeans with various types of tails. Now, there are many things besides tails that are moved. This tiny boy that was born in 1985 had 3 arms, and this extra arm will be surgically removed eventually when he's a little older. The mother was a 21-year-old Kanana Stefan of Tanzania, Africa. And she was afraid to take this little boy out of the hospital because the local natives wanted to kill the child and considered it a devil for this extra appendage. And Mrs. Silver here has a white husband and a black gardener. And after this little event, she lost both her husband and her gardener. July 25th, 1985. Well, one of the most infamous of all freaks was the Elephant Man. There was even a movie made of the Elephant Man in the early 80s. He was born in London. His name was Merrick. And his mother was frightened and shocked by an elephant shortly before his birth, which was supposedly attributed to his problem. Had a proboscis-like projection of his nose and lips, peculiar deformity of the forehead. He was stopped from exhibiting by the police in several cases, and was plundered of his savings and had a terrible time. These are from Gould's Curiosities of Medicine descriptions. This is J.W. Coffey, and he was billed as the living skeleton by circuses and was in good health with a healthy appetite. And Clemens, on the other hand, had atrophied muscles and was rather sickly. And this is a picture of Clemens as he working in the circus. Many of these thin humans had less than 3 inches between their chest and their spine. Well, today there are millions starving in the world, living skeletons simply because they haven't fitted into the technological society and been able to be of value to the domination systems that rule this world. Now, these domination systems rule the world with their banking systems and their international manipulations, and they're very good at it. Well, just when things like this start to get you down, and you wonder if humanity is doomed, and if things aren't going to the dogs, then there's something usually comes along and picks you up. You just see that humanity has hope for it after all. What helped to bring a little help to the starvation in Africa was the Live Aid. It's a group of musicians that got together and put a show on. It was a billion-plus audience through TV. They raised $40 million. It was a huge success. They played for 16 hours. Musicians from all over the world came. It's things like this that sometimes make you glad you're a human, part of the human race. Well, moving on through the bizarre, multiple-headed humans are very rare. A case is on record in 1486 of twins who were joined back to back, as in this illustration. A two-headed human was born in Italy in 1540. In 1889, these Orisa sisters were born in India and eventually wound up in Europe on public exhibition. And just to make sure that you don't fall asleep, this is the type of baby that hospitals now dispose of before publicity comes along. It's a half fish, half human from 1929. So, dear heart, we're coming to the end of this little report, and there's a little secret that I'd like to tell you about. The secret is that you're living in a potential paradise.